Hello, 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 and welcome to the next session of the African Tea with me, Traveling Frugalista, and my girl, T. Michelle, the travel sister. How you doing, girl?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing well. The weather here is warming up, so yes, I'm a happy Deanna. What you
All
sipping on
right.
over there?
I'm sipping on some coffee, actually some cinnamon coffee from Sierra Leone, and it's delicious.
Cinnamon coffee. Never heard of it. I don't really like coffee, but it might be delicious with some cinnamon added to it. As for me, I am sipping on Tepani tea, which is a tea that's indigenous to South Africa. I know most people know about the whole rooibos tea, but Tepani is actually found in the Limpopo area and is sourced by the Finda people by a woman's collective. So if you ever hear, I definitely suggest giving it a try. Why not? It's indigenous to the country. So now let's dive on into this here tea. We discussed, is Africa your motherland? Then we dived into, is Africa a respite from anti-blackness? And we thought, if the first two are on shaky grounds, what about the whole notion of, is Pan Africanism still viable on the African continent? What say you, T. Michelle?
Well, first, I think we got to start off with a definition of Pan Africanism because there are many definitions out there. It means different things to different people. So for me, I think it's a simple concept. It basically means that, people of African descent all over the globe have common interests and we should all be united. Uh, I do believe that based on that definition that it is still a viable concept. However, with the proviso that it needs to be reimagined because how it is currently practiced is definitely on shaky grounds. What say you?
Well, seeing that I refer to myself as a reformed Pan Africanist, I think it's safe to say I think the idea of Pan Africanism here on the continent is, yeah, it's a no, 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 not even possible. Um, with your definition of Pan Africanism, I can agree with a little to agree, but that's not my working definition of Pan Africanism. I draw my definition from the Pan African Parliament here on the continent, which is that they believe in the idea of one Africa, one people, one language, one currencies, etc. And for me, that's a definite no. And girl, had you seen the videos coming out of the Pan African Parliament that happened this year in South Africa, you too would think, ain't no way that anything could ever be accomplished if you try to say everybody just come together as one. But that's just me.
Well, I think that we have to be realistic. I mean, from the inception, there have been issues regarding Pan Africanism and this whole concept of unity and what it means. Uh, at the first Pan African Congress, there was a schism between, what could probably be described as, the diaspora group who would have been Americans or Caribbeans, Black, British, and others, and those who were on the continent. And I think the diaspora group were seen as more loud, more radical, and wanting to have immediate change, whereas those on the continent were looking to have more incremental change and maybe even were more willing to work with the former European colonizers. And I think you see that same type of schism with the formation of the Organization of African Unity. I mean, they actually literally had two factions that were formed, the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group, who basically had ideas that were diametrically opposed. You had this Monrovia group that basically wanted to, who believed that there should be independent national states, as opposed to one unified continental federation. They felt that while the countries should cooperate and exist in harmony, that they should all be separate, and they should rule their own lands. By contrast, you had the Casablanca group, who was looking to establish a formal continental federation based on political unity, and they were looking for more radical changes. And ultimately, it was the Monrovia group that prevailed. And so that's why we see what we have on the continent today, where you have all of these independent national states, um, each doing their own thing. And so this whole idea of unity has been, one based around conflict from the very inception.
Okay, I'm gonna take it even further because you talking about the whole idea of unity and this, that, and the other. For me, I started to myself. You take it back to the original Pan African Congress, right? When that started, I think it was 1919, something around then. It's like people don't realize that there were very few actual Africans involved with back then. It was primarily Black Brits, Black Americans, and Black Americans from the Caribbean. So you start asking yourself, okay, who are they to be able to speak for those on the continent? And then shoot two with me is at that time, people on the African continent were not referring to themselves as African or Black. That is something that came from Europeans. And it makes sense because Europeans have never seen the value of or the uniqueness of people living on the continent. It was just always they're those Africans, the Blacks, or whatever the case may be. And for me, I start like if we start accepting this whole idea of Africa being one, Blacks being one, in itself, that's a for me at least, that's actually a white supremacist mindset. Because to me, it erases the historical differences that were already here, like thousands of year old differences that should be celebrated and valued, which are celebrated and valued everywhere else in the world. You don't go to Asia and everyone's told that, oh, they're all the same. Or Europe, they're all the same. Hell, in Europe, the French and the British fought 100-year war over their ethnic differences. So why is it that when it comes to the African continent, we are told to believe that everyone is just African, and anything less than that is somehow problematic? I'm not in it. And then for me, when I started traveling to the African continent, that's when my eyes really started opening to it. And I was like, wait a minute. And I've been told all this since I was like this true, Pan Africanist. That's why, like today, whether you like Tariq Nasheed or not, people are like, oh, he's a flip flopper. He used to be Mr. Pro, this, that, and Africa. I actually can understand where he's coming from because I used to be like that. But when I started traveling, I started realizing that Africa really is not one. It's so diverse. When you go to the north, south, east, west, central, you see these ethnic differences, not just with skin tone. Because to me, I don't silly go with the skin tone part, but true ethnic with like cultural histories that are so rich, especially when you go to like the east, the north, west. It's a beautiful thing. And I feel like if we adopt this whole notion of Pan Africanism becoming one, then it erases that. And I'm just not here for that.
I would have to agree with you. I mean, I think that once you're here on the continent, you definitely see the diversity of culture, languages, and everything. And most people here on the continent, they identify with their ethnic group first and foremost. Uh, you just don't come around generally people who are calling themselves Black. They may be Yoruba, they may be Akan, but they're not going to tell you that they're Black people. and they may not even consider themselves African in the sense that that's how they self-identify. Because I think for most that I come across, their ethnic group is their primary self-identifier, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, as you said, the diversity of culture is so beautiful. It's it's long-standing, thousands of years old, and people have all type of different traditional rituals and practices. There are a multitude of languages, more than 2,000 here on the continent. And so, this idea that people have to unify and be one doesn't make sense. Does that mean that people can cooperate with each other and work towards a common goal? Absolutely. But this idea that we all have to be quote unquote, African, and somehow forget about our different cultural practices and backgrounds is just absurd to me. And that includes both people on the continent and in the diaspora.
Mm, 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 mm. All I would say is you better than me. Because I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't even know if it's possible on the continent folks to work together. Like I said, people got to go and research Pan African Parliament in South Africa, and if you see the way these grown people, men and women, were physically fighting a big one over language, you just be like, ain't no way. And I stand by what I said with the original Pan African Congress. If at its inception, it was primarily those outside of the African continent. Is it something that's even able? Because who are we outside of the African continent to be telling Africans what to do? I have accepted today that I am in blue passport holding American when I'm on the continent. Folks don't see me as African. I'm okay with that. Hell, sometimes they see me white. And guess what? I'm okay with that because the reality is that sociologists like to say that, race is a social construct. And for me, it is in the sense that what is defined as black, white, or whatever is definitely socially constructed. But there are ethnic differences between people, even right here on the continent. There are huge ethnic differences. The African continent is probably the most diverse place in terms of ethnicity. So for me, I'm like, who am I to even start forcing people to identify as black just to try and work with them, or to tell them that they all must speak the same language? And then it just doesn't make sense. And to me, it's actually anti-African, very much so. And it serves no purpose other than to create distraction and prevent people from working together. And to me, that is basically what's always been the case. Europeans have never given anything to black people or to those in Africa that's been in their best interest. So why is it that we're going to believe that this whole idea of us being African or black was designed to be in our best interest? It doesn't make sense. For me, not at all does it make sense. So am I going to get upset when I think recently it was making the rounds of this young guy talking about he's Somali, but he's African, but he's not black, and everyone's in an uproar. I was like, okay, what's the problem? Who cares? He's saying he's African. Is he saying he's not black because he don't identify with somebody in South Africa, or he don't identify with somebody in Nigeria? But they're not the same people, and they never have been. They are a distinct ethnic group, has a long cultural history. So why should we be like, oh, it's okay to adopt this nonsense?
Yeah, I think I would have to agree with that. I mean, as I discussed, based on my definition of what Pan Africanism is, I do believe that all people of African descent have some common interests, and that would be to create a a strong continent. However, this idea of unity is where I give pause. I think that the only thing that we should be unified on is economics, because generally speaking, all around the globe, Black people, people of African descent, are being deprived of resources. They're having their resources stolen and manipulated by outside foreigners and colonizers. And people are suffering. And so for me, that really is the only thing that we should be unified on. And unfortunately, that seems to be the discussion that you hear of the least. I hear more people, and it's unfortunate because I'm even hearing Africans be more vocal about this whole idea of Pan Africanism and that they should adopt it. And so, there's this discussion around whether or not there should be one language in Africa. And specifically, I've heard that it should be Kiswahili. And I have to question and ask why. Like, what is the benefit of that? How does that encourage and make Africa a stronger place? How does that get the colonizers off manipulating the people and stealing resources? Like, none of that. For me, these are just time wasting discussions. Whether it's, we should have one language, whether there should be one primary group, whether we should all be considered Black or African. At the end of the day, all of those things are insignificant to me when these economies are being basically controlled by foreigners. And so you have a group of people who are uniting around this idea of oneness and being unified, but there's nothing really constructive that I've heard that's coming out of it.
Okay. You brought up three things that I got shown. First, you mentioned the whole notion of us African descent, right? And people around people with dark skin around the globe working together. I'm from California, born and raised in LA, and I was raised with a lot of Tongan and Samoan people, who, guess what, look like me, yet they are not seen as African and or of African descent. Why is that? So these are the type of questions that I started thinking to myself, like, who is to say that those of us in the Americans are the ones that are of African descent or a part of a diaspora? Do we come from the African continent? To not step on toes, I'm going to say I believe most of us do come from the African continent. I won't leave this as far to say all, because that's somewhat of controversy to some people. But I'm going to say I believe most of us do come from the continent. But does that mean that we need to be in this umbrella of those of African descent? I'm not so sure. I'm not sold on that because we've been gone for too long. For me, we have to talking about what is like the diaspora. And for me, I just believe that diaspora really should be reserved for those who are first, second, third generation, those who are sending remittance home to their home country. And yeah, my home country is American, so I'm not sending remittance to anybody. And then you touch on the idea of people coming together to work together, regardless of how they identify, as long as they are African. But see, that's part of my issue too with this notion of Pan Africanism. If folks can't get it right on their continent, which we see that they can't, hell, they can't get it right in their own small country. And I gotta tell my husband, because he's from a kingdom, y'all can't get it right in your kingdom. Where do we fit in all this? People who've been removed for generations, who have absolutely no ties to the continent, like none. Who are we to think we're going to be able to build something if folks can't build something in their own backyard? But truth be told, that opinion is not just reserved for those on the continent. It's reserved for those in the U.S. too. Because I used to be, affiliated with the quote-unquote conscious community in L.A. And they love to be talking about how they go to Africa. I'm a nation build. I'm going to teach Africans this. How you going to teach Africans how to be African and you ain't never even been to Africa? That's issue one. But two, they're not building their own communities and cities back in L.A. So again, if you can't build your own small city up, how are you talking about building up a whole continent and working together? It just don't even make sense. And as for the language Kiswahili, girl, that's always been boggled my mind since my first trip to the Swahili coast. And I was like, if this don't sound like Arabic, I don't know what it sounds like. So when everybody keep on to say that that's an indigenous language to the continent, I'm like, I gotta give a little pause on that because the elements of Arabic are there. But more importantly, again, that continent is massive. So somebody in Senegal who's speaking Wolof have absolutely no ties to this language. Now, does it make sense as a language of use and commerce for, I would say, East and Southeast Africa? Absolutely, it does. But outside of that, it just doesn't make sense. And again, I don't believe it is something that comes from the voices of those on the continent. It comes from those who typically are external, thinking that they can dictate Africans what they should and should not do. And I don't believe that those of us in the diaspora are in the position to be telling Africans what to do. I just don't.
Well, yeah, this idea of one language is just crazy to me, because there is literally no way that people here in West Africa are going to take up learning Kiswahili. And I mean, I've even had several tell me they think the idea is ridiculous. And there's no way that they're going to be learning and speaking that. They have their own languages that have been in their communities for thousands of years. And there just is no logical reason to do it, because generally it would only allow them to be able to communicate with people in Eastern Africa. It really isn't a language of commerce with any place else in the world, because most people in the world aren't speaking Kiswahili. So again, I think it's just another time waster, as I call it. And so, as people are spending all this time talking online and focusing on, what language we should speak, which country should be the most dominant one, or which country should be at the forefront. Uh, that's just time that's being wasted that could be used on actually building strong communities. Because what we have now is, I mean, let's be honest, we have a bunch of weak countries that are nothing like their former glories, kingdoms that once existed here on the continent. And there is no real discussion of getting back to that. All of this time is being wasted on foolishness. And so, for me, it's very disturbing to see the African people take up this idea of, Pan Africanism in its current form. Because I've always believed, number one, that for Pan Africanism to work, it has to be initiated, and it has to be strongest on the continent. It definitely can't come from outside of Africa, from the diaspora. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous to me. Um, and then also, uh, people have to actually do something. It can't just be about talk. And I think that that's once again where we see that there's no real action being done, because all I see is talk. I mean, you literally can go on YouTube on any given day and see all types of panels where people are discussing this whole issue of Pan Africanism. But what you don't hear being discussed is, strategic plans and actions to take control of these economies, to take control of resources, to create a world where people of African descent are not suffering and are not being malaligned, marginalized by foreigners. Because as it stands now, it's just a free for all for any and everybody to come here and do whatever they want to. And I mean, we have to start being honest about these things if it's going to change.
Well, people who know me know that I am no longer a Pan Africanist per se, in the sense of the whole one this one that, but I am very much for the regional bloc alliances on the continent. They make sense to me, and that's why I look at what's going on right now in the Sahel with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and how they're coming together. And of course, the Pan Africanist Kiswahili people are like, oh, it's because they speak French. And I'm like, no, it's not just because they speak French. It's because they have long historical ethnic ties to each other from that, I believe it's the Mali Empire. And to me, if you can actually start respecting some of those old historical kingdoms, things can move forward. And I feel like that's what was missed with the Pan African Congress, with the AU even today. That nobody stopped to say, hey, This was never about us. These boundaries weren't about us. We had some kingdoms before colonization ever started. Why don't we take things back to that and then try to move forward? To me, that would have made sense instead of these 54 countries that we have today that people can't get along with. Because it's like Europeans intentionally mushed people together who were enemies just to keep things unstable so they could always come in here and be, the great white saviors, because that's what they attempt to do. That's what they was doing in France. And now you see those three countries like, wait a minute, y'all done been here and things is constantly worse. They like, we taking it back. I mean, when I tell you the level of pride that I had when I saw how they started working together, they was like, you want to invade Niger, just know that we gonna step up too, because we won. And you see how they even shut down the whole notion of ECOWAS going in to tap dance for the French. Tinubu, the president of Nigeria, went to his Senate thinking he was going to get authorization to go in there so that they can send troops to invade Niger. And the Senate there said, we're not having it. And the reason for that is the historical ties. The northern parts of Nigeria are the Hausa people, and they have what? Ties to Niger. They wasn't gonna be okay with you sitting there sending their people into I to go and kill essentially their own people. And I feel like that's what's needed on the African continent. This whole idea of one Africa, one Pan Africanist, like hodgepodge, is not gonna work. It's never been one. Get back to those old historical ties and then start working and building together. For me, to be strong, you got to have a strong military to protect yourself. And that's what we see happening today in the Sahel. The three of them, Burkina, like I said, Burkina, Niger, Mali, they coming together militarily first to start strengthening in that area. Then they're gonna start working together economically to see, where each respective group is strong in regards to what they have, natural resources, etc., and start moving from there. And I tell you, I just love the new temporary president of Burkina. I think his name is Traore. When he went and he was speaking at that Russia African summit, he said these days Africans going around the world just being known as global beggars need to stop. He said, why are we not feeding our own people? Why are we not building our own things? And that's exactly what African continent needs. But it needs to start regionally. Because if you, like you said, if you're weak everywhere, how can all weak people come together and make something strong? It doesn't make sense. Start building up your own. And I say the same thing for those back in the US. For me, if you want to accept that you're part of the African diaspora, so be it. But can you start trying to at least build up something in your own community first? Instead of thinking that you're going to come to the African continent and teach Africans how to be African. When I see stuff like that online, I just be wanting to kill over that plate. You ain't got two good pennies to rub together, but you get ready to go over to Africa and you going to build some and tell people how to be good Africans. Do this make sense? Absolutely not.
Well, girl, I have to tell you, I'm proud of what's going on in the Sahel too. I have been cheering them on and hoping that it will spread, especially here in West Africa. Traore is definitely my favorite, and that man is channeling Thomas Sankara. I tell you,
yes, he is. Yes, he is.
He is on it, and so I hope that if we really are talking about Pan Africanism, that people will mobilize around him and keep them safe because he is doing it. He's doing exactly what needs to be done. And I agree with you. This needs to happen widespread on the continent and widespread on a regional basis. Another thing that I do want to talk about is just this whole idea of something that I often hear Pan Africanists say is that, Europeans are unified. And I just have to laugh because these people have never been unified. How many wars have they fought? They literally are fighting two wars now and about to start another one. These people have never been unified. They are the most savage and boring people that you ever want to see. The only thing that they've ever been unified on is subjugating us and controlling our resources. And I mean, the moment that we realize that and start taking action against it, the better off we'll be.
Girl, you ain't said nothing but the truth with that. And the reality is that when you start traveling the world, that's what I encourage everyone to travel the African continent and other places, just so you can start seeing that some of the stuff you've been told simply is not true. There is no place in the world That's even a smaller landmass that you have on African continent, where the people are one, on one language, on one currency. Yet everybody keep wanting to try to tell Africans that's what they're supposed to do. You don't. People aren't going to India telling Indians, well, everybody need to speak Mandarin because it's Asia and everybody in Asia should speak Mandarin. They're not going to the Japanese and saying, oh, well, you should speak Mandarin because you're an Asian. Everybody should be speaking Mandarin. It doesn't happen. And like you said, even in Europe, if we get told last time I checked, Russia is a Euro Asian country, and Russians are what European as well as Turkey. But are the British and the French accepting them as European? Hell no, and they never have. There have always been distinct blocks in Europe, whether it's Western Europeans, Eastern, Southern, etc. And Africa is no different. And I think it's time Africans and those of us in the diaspora, if you want to be referred to as diaspora, start pushing back on some of these notions, do a hard reset on the idea of Pan-Africanism, African, Black, etc. So people can actually start working and doing what's in their best interest economically, militarily, everything. Instead of wasting time spinning around chasing, the concepts that were given to us by Europeans. For me, the whole notion of Pan-Africanism belongs in the same pot as integration, the concept of the talented 10, and people, I know people not going to like this one, but this whole one drop rule. None of these things came from us. They were given to us. And as far as I'm concerned, if you subscribe to any of them, you're subscribing to the notion of white supremacy. And well, for me, I'm just not here for it. You laughing at me.
Girl, you have said a word and I can't dispute not near one of them.
Well, that's the end of our tea session for the week. I know some of the things we said was served a bit hot, but hey, that's what we're here for. So we hope we've left you with a little thought in regards to, is Pan-Africanism viable on the continent? And we look forward to seeing you on our next session of the African Tea.
Bye, everybody. If you like what you heard today, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe so that you don't miss any more of our upcoming videos. See you soon.